I was 23 when my grandmother died, and I remember the funeral mostly for how my mother positioned herself. Not at the front of the receiving line, that would have been too obvious, but slightly to the side, where she could see everyone who entered, catalog their expressions, measure their grief against some internal scale only she understood. My grandmother had been sick for 14 months. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed late, treated aggressively at first, then palliatively when it became clear the treatments were only buying weeks at the cost of quality. I'd visited her every Sunday during those 14 months, driving the 47 miles from my apartment in the city to the house where my mother had grown up, where my grandmother had lived alone since my grandfather's death 9 years earlier. The house was a sprawling colonial on 3 acres, built in 1887, renovated extensively in the 1960s and again in the 1990s. My grandmother loved that house with a fierce, possessive love. She knew every creak in the floorboards, every water stain on the ceiling plaster, every rosebush in the garden by name and planting date. During my Sunday visits, even when she was too weak to leave her bedroom, she would give me instructions. Check the gutters on the east side. They collect leaves. Make sure the thermostat in the sunroom isn't set too high. It warps the wood. Water the ferns on the back porch. They're older than you are. My mother visited too, but not on Sundays. She came on Wednesdays, always in the afternoon, always for exactly 90 minutes. I know this because my grandmother mentioned it, not complaining exactly, but noting it the way she noted everything, as a fact to be recorded and remembered. "Your mother was here Wednesday," she'd say. "She brought those store-bought cookies I don't like, the ones with the waxy chocolate." I never overlapped with my mother during those 14 months. Our schedules, accidentally or deliberately, never coincided. I didn't think much of it at the time. My mother and I had a cordial relationship, the kind where we spoke every few weeks, exchanged pleasantries, asked after each other's work and health without expecting or offering detailed answers. She'd remarried when I was 16 to a man named Richard who owned a commercial real estate firm. They lived in a different part of the state, 3 hours away, in a planned community with a golf course and a gate. At the funeral, my mother wore black silk and pearls. She greeted people with a practiced sadness, her hand resting briefly on their arms, her voice low and measured. "Thank you for coming." She would have appreciated it. Yes, it was peaceful at the end. Yes, we're all managing. My Uncle David, my grandmother's younger child, stood near the casket looking lost. He was 51, had worked the same job at the county water department for 26 years, and lived with his wife and 3 daughters in a modest house 12 miles from my grandmother's estate. He and my mother had never been close. At family gatherings, they occupied opposite ends of the room, speaking when necessary but never seeking each other out. The reading of the will happened 6 days after the funeral in a law office downtown with wood paneling and leather chairs that squeaked. The lawyer was elderly, a man named Mr. Hutchins, who had known my grandmother for 40 years. He wore bifocals and read slowly, pausing at commas as if they required contemplation. My grandmother's estate was substantial. The house and land, valued at approximately $1.2 million. Investment accounts totaling $680,000. A small portfolio of municipal bonds, life insurance, jewelry, furniture, books, the accumulated possessions of 84 years. The will was straightforward. Everything was to be divided equally between my mother and Uncle David, 50-50. The house could be sold and the proceeds split, or one could buy out the other's share at fair market value. There were smaller bequests, $10,000 to each grandchild, some jewelry distributed among the granddaughters, specific books to specific people. My grandmother had been meticulous. Every item of value was listed, assigned, accounted for. Mr. Hutchins finished reading and looked up over his bifocals. "Any questions?" My mother smiled. "It's very clear. Thank you." Uncle David nodded. He looked relieved, I thought. Perhaps he'd been worried about something messier. "There are some logistical matters," Mr. Hutchins continued. "The house will need to be cleared, maintained until a decision is made about sale or buyout. Utilities, taxes, insurance. These continue regardless. I'd suggest designating someone to manage the property in the interim." "I'll handle it," my mother said immediately. "I'm the eldest and I have more flexibility in my schedule. David, if that's all right with you?" Uncle David nodded again. "Sure, Linda. That makes sense." "I'll need keys," my mother said, "and I should probably start going through things soon, before winter. The house needs winterizing." Mr. Hutchins produced a key ring from a drawer. "These are the spares your mother kept here. I believe there are others at the property." My mother took them. I watched her fingers close around the metal, and I remember thinking, in a vague, unformed way, that she looked satisfied. Not sad, not grieving, satisfied. The first time I went back to my grandmother's house after the funeral, it was early October. I'd called my mother to ask if I could pick up some books my grandmother had left me, a collection of first edition Steinbecks that had belonged to her father. My mother said, of course, she'd be there on Thursday morning if I wanted to stop by. I arrived at 10. My mother's car, a silver Lexus, was in the driveway. The front door was unlocked. I walked in and the house felt different. Not empty because my grandmother's furniture was still there, her paintings on the walls, her rugs on the floors, but different, disturbed. I found my mother in my grandmother's bedroom going through the dresser drawers. She had 3 cardboard boxes beside her, one labeled Donate, one labeled Keep, one labeled Trash. She was working systematically, removing items, examining them briefly, placing them in the appropriate box. "Hi, sweetheart," she said without looking up. "The books are in the study. I set them aside for you." "Thanks." I didn't move. I watched her pull out a folded sweater, cashmere, pale blue, my grandmother's favorite. She held it up, checked for moth holes, then placed it in the Donate box. "Are you doing this alone?" I asked. "David said he didn't have time. His youngest is in soccer, and his wife works weekends now. I told him I'd handle the sorting." "That's a lot of work." "I don't mind. Someone has to do it." She closed one drawer, opened another. Scarves. She pulled them out in handfuls, silk and wool and cotton, decades of accumulated scarves. Most went to Donate. A few, the expensive ones, went to Keep. I stood there for another minute, then went to the study and collected my books. They were in a neat stack on the desk, tied with twine. My grandmother had labeled them with my name on a card, her handwriting shaky but legible. I carried them to my car, and when I came back inside, my mother was in the bathroom, sorting through medicine cabinets. "Find them okay?" she called. "Yes. Thank you." "Good. Drive safe." I left. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about the boxes, the systematic sorting, the speed of it. My grandmother had been dead for 3 weeks. Over the next 2 months, I drove past the house several times. Not on purpose, exactly, but the route to my grandmother's house was also the route to other places I needed to go, and I found myself taking that route more often than necessary. Each time, my mother's car was there. Sometimes there was a moving truck. Sometimes there were other cars I didn't recognize. Estate sale people, I assumed, or appraisers. In December, my mother called. "I wanted to update you on the house," she said. Her voice was bright, efficient. "David and I have decided to sell. The market's good right now, and neither of us really wants to manage the property long term. We've hired a realtor, and we're listing in January." "Okay," I said. "We're holding an estate sale for the furniture and smaller items. Anything you want, you should come get in the next few weeks. After that, whatever doesn't sell goes to auction." "What about the things Grandma left to specific people? In the will?" "Oh, those are all set aside. I've been very careful about that. But there's a lot of other stuff. Dishes, linens, tools, Christmas decorations. No point letting it all just sit there." I went back the following Saturday. The house was transformed. Furniture had been rearranged into showroom-style vignettes. Price tags hung from lamps, chairs, mirrors. A woman with a clipboard sat at a card table near the entrance, taking money from a steady stream of strangers who wandered through my grandmother's rooms, picking up her possessions, negotiating prices. My mother stood in the kitchen, supervising. She saw me and waved me over. "Isn't this incredible? We've already made almost $6,000 and we're only halfway through the day." I looked around. The kitchen table where I'd eaten Sunday dinners for 23 years had a sold sticker on it. The china cabinet, empty now, its contents presumably already purchased and carted away, was marked $400. "Where's the china?" I asked. "Grandma's wedding china?" "Sold this morning. A dealer bought the whole set." "I thought that was supposed to go to Uncle David's daughters. Wasn't that in the will?" My mother frowned, a small crease appearing between her eyebrows. The will specified a few pieces of jewelry and some books. The china wasn't listed. "Grandma told me she wanted her granddaughters to have it. She said so explicitly." "Well, it wasn't in the will, sweetheart, and we needed to clear the house. If she'd wanted them to have it, she should have written it down." I didn't argue. I walked through the rooms, looking for anything that might still be available, anything I recognized and wanted to save. Most of it was already gone or spoken for. I found a few small items, a vase, a framed photograph, a wooden box that had held my grandmother's sewing supplies. I paid the woman at the card table. She wrapped them in newspaper and put them in a shopping bag. When I left, my mother was negotiating with a couple over the dining room table. I heard her laugh, a light, musical sound. "I can't go any lower than that," she was saying. "It's a genuine antique." The house sold in March, 3 weeks after listing. The buyers paid $1.31 million, slightly above asking. My mother called to tell me, her voice buoyant. "We're closing in April. The realtor was fantastic. She really knew how to stage it." "That's good," I said. "David's thrilled. His share will pay off his mortgage and then some, and Richard and I are thinking about buying a place in Scottsdale for the winters." I waited. "You'll get your bequest, of course. Grandma left you $10,000. That'll be distributed after closing, once all the expenses are settled." "What expenses?" "Oh, you know. Realtor commission, repairs we had to make before listing, cleaning services, estate sale company fees. It all adds up. But there should still be plenty to go around." The closing happened on April 18th. I know because Uncle David called me that evening. It was the first time we'd spoken since the funeral. "Did your mother tell you about the settlement?" he asked. "She said it went through. Congratulations." "Yeah." He paused. "Listen, I wanted to ask you something. Did your grandmother ever talk to you about the investments? The stocks and bonds?" "Not really. Why?" "I'm looking at the final accounting, and the numbers don't quite match up with what I remember from the will reading. The investment accounts, they were supposed to be around $680,000, right?" "That sounds right." "The final settlement shows $510,000. I sat down. "What happened to the rest?" "Your mother says there were market losses, and some accounts had already been liquidated to pay for your grandmother's care. Hospice, medications, that kind of thing. Grandma had insurance, good insurance." "I know. That's what I thought too." He sighed. "I don't know. Maybe I'm remembering wrong. Maybe the $680,000 was before the medical expenses. Linda has all the documentation. She says everything's accounted for." "Have you seen the documentation?" "She sent me a summary, just a spreadsheet. I asked for the actual statements, but she said they're in storage at her house, and she'll send them when she has time." We talked for a few more minutes, circling around the same questions without reaching any conclusions. When we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and thought about my mother in my grandmother's bedroom, sorting through drawers with business-like efficiency 3 weeks after the funeral. I thought about the estate sale, the missing china, the house sold and emptied within 6 months. I got up and found a notebook. I wrote down dates, amounts, questions. I didn't know yet what I was documenting or why, but I wrote it all down anyway. The first formal request I made for estate documentation was in June, 13 months after my grandmother's death. I sent my mother an email, not a phone call, because I wanted the request in writing, though I didn't consciously articulate why at the time. I asked for copies of the final accounting, the investment statements showing the market losses she'd mentioned, and receipts for the medical expenses that had supposedly depleted the accounts. She responded 3 days later. "Of course, sweetheart, I have everything filed away. I'll pull it together and send it to you. Things have been hectic with the Scottsdale place. We're doing renovations and it's taking all my time. Give me a few weeks." 6 weeks passed. I sent a follow-up email. She called this time, her voice warm and slightly exasperated. "I haven't forgotten. I've been looking for the files. Richard reorganized the home office and now I can't find anything. You know how men are with filing systems. I'll keep looking." In August, I asked again. This time she sounded irritated. "Why do you need all this? The estate is settled. Everyone got what they were supposed to get. Are you having money problems? Because if you need help, you should just say so." "I don't need money," I said. "I just want to understand the accounting." Uncle David had questions too. David always has questions. He's never trusted me, you know. Even when we were kids, he acted like I was trying to cheat him out of something. I've been completely transparent about everything. Then the documentation should be easy to provide. It's not about easy or hard. It's about being treated like I'm some kind of criminal when I spent months managing that estate, doing work David couldn't be bothered to help with. I took care of everything, and this is the thanks I get. We went in circles for another 10 minutes. She never said she wouldn't send the documents. She just never sent them. I started calling Uncle David more regularly. At first, our conversations were brief, awkward. We didn't know each other well. Our relationship had always been mediated through my grandmother. I was Linda's daughter, he was her brother, and we occupied those roles without much direct interaction. But now we had a common question, and that question gave us something to talk about. "Did you ever get those statements?" I'd ask. "Not yet. She says she's still looking." "It's been 4 months." "I know." He'd sigh. "Maybe I should just let it go. The money's spent anyway. What's done is done." "But don't you want to know?" "Want to know what? That my sister took more than her share?" "Yeah, I probably already know that. But what am I going to do about it? Sue her? Drag the whole family through court? My wife says I should drop it. She says it's not worth the stress." I understood his reluctance. Uncle David was 52, had spent his entire adult life avoiding conflict, working a steady job, raising his daughters, maintaining a peaceful household. His wife, Margaret, was a school nurse, kind, practical, exhausted by the daily demands of her work. They didn't have money for lawyers. They didn't have energy for battles. But I kept asking anyway. And gradually, over months of short phone calls, I started to learn things. "You know what I remembered?" David said one evening in October. "Mom gave Linda power of attorney. This was maybe 2 years before she died, when she was still pretty healthy. Linda said it was just a precaution in case Mom ever needed help managing bills or whatever. At the time, it seemed reasonable." "Did she have power of attorney over the finances?" "I think so. Medical and financial both. Mom signed everything over." "While she was still competent?" "Oh, yeah. She was sharp as a tack then. This was before the cancer." I wrote this down in my notebook. The notebook had become a habit. I kept it in my kitchen drawer, and whenever I learned something new, I added it. Dates, amounts, conversations, inconsistencies. I didn't know what I was building toward. I just knew I needed to remember. In November, I attended my cousin Rachel's birthday dinner. Rachel was Uncle David's eldest daughter, 27, unmarried, working as a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm in the city. We'd never been close. She was 4 years younger than me, and our paths had rarely crossed as adults. But she'd invited me, probably out of politeness, and I accepted, curious to see her. The dinner was at a Thai restaurant, just Rachel and 6 of her friends. I felt out of place at first. They were all younger, talking about jobs and roommates and dating apps with an easy familiarity I no longer shared. But after the meal, as people were leaving, Rachel asked if I wanted to get coffee. We walked to a cafe down the block. It was cold, the first real cold snap of the season, and we sat inside near the window, watching people hurry past in coats and scarves. "Dad said you've been asking about Grandma's estate," Rachel said. She didn't sound accusatory, just curious. "Yeah, some things don't add up." "Like what?" I told her. "The missing money in the investment accounts. The estate sale proceeds that seemed low, the documentation that my mother kept promising but never producing, the china that was supposed to go to David's daughters but got sold instead." Rachel listened, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. She had her father's face, round, open, guileless, but her mother's sharp eyes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I never got to say goodbye properly," she said finally. "To Grandma. The last few months, Aunt Linda was always there when I tried to visit. She'd say Grandma was sleeping or having a bad day, or the hospice nurse said no visitors. I'd call ahead and Linda would say, 'Tomorrow would be better.' And then tomorrow she'd say the same thing. I saw Grandma maybe 3 times in those last 4 months. I didn't know that. I tried not to make a big deal about it. I thought maybe I was being oversensitive, but it felt like Linda was gatekeeping, controlling who got access." "Did you tell your dad?" "He said not to cause problems. Linda was doing all the caretaking and we should be grateful. And maybe he was right. Maybe I was just being selfish, wanting to see Grandma when she was dying." Rachel looked down at her coffee. "But I also remember that Grandma wanted to give me something. She told me this about a year before she died. She said she had her mother's wedding ring, and she wanted me to have it because I was the eldest granddaughter, and that's how it was supposed to pass down. Did you ever see that ring in the estate?" "No." "What did it look like?" "Gold band engraved inside with a date. 1919. It had 3 small diamonds set in a row. Grandma wore it sometimes, on her right hand." I tried to remember. My grandmother had owned a lot of jewelry. She'd accumulated pieces over 84 years, gifts and inheritances and purchases. Some of it had been listed in the will, most hadn't. "I'll look through the will inventory," I said. "If it was listed, you should have gotten it." "I don't think it was listed. I think Linda took it." Rachel said this matter-of-factly without anger, just a statement of what she believed to be true. We talked for another hour. Rachel told me about other things, smaller things, but they accumulated. The set of silver spoons that were supposed to go to her sister but never appeared. The painting of the harbor that had hung in my grandmother's hallway, which my grandmother had once told Rachel's youngest sister she could have, but which wasn't mentioned in the will and wasn't at the estate sale. The antique sewing machine that David had wanted, which Linda said had been broken and disposed of, though David swore he'd seen it working just months before. "It's like she erased things," Rachel said. "Things Grandma promised people. Things that had meaning beyond just money. And because they weren't in the official will, they just disappeared." When I got home that night, I added everything to my notebook. Then I sat at my laptop and started searching. Property records, public documents, social media. I found the deed for my mother's Scottsdale condo, purchased in May, 9 months after my grandmother's death, $485,000. I cross-referenced this with what I knew about my mother's finances. She and Richard were comfortable, but not wealthy. Richard's business was successful but modest. They lived well, but not extravagantly. Before my grandmother's death, they'd never mentioned wanting a second home. I found photos my mother had posted on Facebook. The condo, renovated extensively. New kitchen, new bathrooms, new flooring. Furniture that looked expensive. In one photo, my mother wore jewelry I didn't recognize. A necklace with large stones, emerald or tourmaline, set in white gold. I looked at the photo for a long time. Then I searched for estate jewelry sales in our area, auction results, anything that might show what had happened to my grandmother's collection. I found some pieces. A few items had sold at a local auction house, properly documented, proceeds presumably going into the estate, but most of the jewelry was unaccounted for. In December, I created a spreadsheet. I listed everything I knew. Known assets, from will reading, house, $1,200,000 estimated value. Investments, $680,000. Bonds, $120,000. Life insurance, not specified, amount unknown. Personal property, not itemized, value unknown. Actual settlement, house sale, $1,310,000. Less realtor commission, 6%, $78,600. Less claimed repairs/staging, $43,000 per my mother. Net from house, $1,188,400. Investments, claimed final value, $510,000. Claimed losses/medical expenses, $170,000. Bonds, $120,000. Total distributed, approximately $1,818,400, split between two heirs, $909,200 each. My questions. What repairs cost $43,000? House was well maintained. Where is documentation for $170,000 in medical expenses? What happened to life insurance? Was there a policy? Estate sale proceeds. How much was collected? Where did it go? Jewelry. What was sold? What was kept? What was given away? Were there other accounts? Other assets? I stared at the spreadsheet. The numbers looked almost right. If you didn't scrutinize too carefully, if you trusted the person managing the estate, you might accept them and move on. Uncle David had done exactly that. He'd received his check for $909,200, paid off his mortgage, put the rest in savings for his daughter's futures, and tried not to think about whether it was correct. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. In January, 15 months after my grandmother's death, I called the lawyer who'd read the will, Mr. Hutchins. His secretary said he was retired, but she could transfer me to the partner who'd taken over his cases. The new lawyer, a woman named Ms. Brennan, spoke in careful, measured sentences. I can't discuss specific details of the estate without authorization from the executors, but I can tell you that the estate was closed and settled according to the final accounting submitted by Mrs. Whitmore, your mother. If you have concerns about that accounting, you'd need to file a formal challenge through probate court. How long do I have to do that? The statute of limitations varies by jurisdiction and circumstance. Generally, if fraud is alleged, you may have several years, but the sooner you act, the better. Evidence becomes harder to obtain as time passes. What kind of evidence would I need? Documentation showing that the accounting was inaccurate or that the executor breached their fiduciary duty. Bank statements, receipts, appraisals, communications indicating improper transfers or sales. The burden of proof would be on you. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat very still, thinking about what she'd said. Fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, formal challenge. These were serious words. Legal words, the kind of words that meant lawyers and courts and years of family warfare. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I also wasn't ready to let it go. I called Rachel. Would you be willing to help me look into this? Really look into it? What would that involve? Research, document requests, maybe hiring someone to track down records. I don't know exactly, but I can't do it alone and your dad doesn't want to pursue it. He's afraid, Rachel said, of Linda, of conflict, of everything falling apart. He's always been afraid. What about you? She was quiet for a moment. I'm angry. I was angry at the funeral, when Linda stood there acting like the devoted daughter when I know Grandma was frustrated with her. I was angry at the estate sale, watching strangers buy Grandma's things. I'm still angry. So yeah, I'll help. We met the following week at a library branch halfway between our apartments. Rachel brought her laptop. I brought my notebook and the spreadsheet. We sat at a table in the reference section, surrounded by rows of books nobody was reading, and we began to plan. First thing we need is the life insurance information, Rachel said. That should be public record if a death benefit was paid. I can search for policy records, but we'll need Grandma's Social Security number. I have that. from her obituary. Good. Next, we need to see if Linda made any large deposits or purchases in the months before and after Grandma died. That'll tell us if money was moving in ways it shouldn't have been. How do we get that? We probably can't directly, but we can look at public records, property purchases, vehicle registrations, anything that requires disclosure. And if we do end up going legal, we can subpoena bank records. You sound like you've done this before. Rachel smiled slightly. I'm an accountant. I know how money moves and how people try to hide it. White-collar crime is basically just bad accounting with intent. We worked for 3 hours. Rachel showed me how to search property databases, court records, business filings. We found the Scottsdale condo purchase, traced the financing, noted that my mother and Richard had paid cash, no mortgage, $485,000 in cash, 9 months after my grandmother's death. Where did they get that kind of liquid cash? Rachel asked. Richard's business? Maybe, but his company's filings show it's an LLC with modest revenue. He takes a salary, probably comfortable, but not $500,000 in cash comfortable. She made a note. This is worth investigating. We found the vehicle registration too. My mother had bought a new Mercedes in July, $73,000, also paid in cash. People don't usually pay cash for cars, Rachel said. They finance, even if they can afford to pay outright. Better to keep the cash invested. Paying cash is what you do when you want to avoid documentation, or when you suddenly have a lot of cash you need to spend. I watched her work, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, her eyes scanning documents with practiced efficiency. She'd pull up a record, read it, cross-reference it with something else, make notes in a spiral notebook she'd brought. She was methodical, patient, good at this. Can I ask you something? I said. Why are you helping me? This is going to take time and it might not lead anywhere. Rachel looked up. Because Grandma was kind to me. When I was a kid, my parents were struggling. Dad's salary was barely enough, and Mom was working part-time, and there were 3 of us girls. Grandma would slip me $20 bills when no one was looking. She paid for my class trips, my textbooks, my prom dress. She never made a big deal about it, never made us feel like charity cases. She just helped. She paused, choosing her words carefully. And when she was dying, I wanted to sit with her, hold her hand, tell her thank you for all of it. But Linda wouldn't let me. Every time I tried, there was an excuse. And then Grandma died, and I never got to say any of it. Rachel's voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. So yeah, if Linda took more than she should have, if she manipulated a sick old woman and stole from her own family, I want that on the record. I want everyone to know, not for revenge, for accuracy. We kept working until the library closed. When we left, we had a list of next steps. 1. Request life insurance records. 2. Search for additional financial accounts in grandmother's name. 3. Document all major purchases my mother made post-estate. 4. Obtain estate sale receipts if possible. 5. Track down the missing jewelry, specifically the 1919 wedding ring. 6. Find someone who could testify about grandmother's wishes regarding specific bequests. It was a start. Not much, but something. On my drive home, I thought about what Rachel had said. Not for revenge, for accuracy. I liked that framing. It felt clean, principled, removed from the messy emotions underneath. But I also knew it wasn't entirely true. Not for me, anyway. I was angry. At my mother, yes, but also at myself for not seeing it sooner, for not visiting more during those final months, for not asking harder questions when the numbers didn't add up, for accepting my mother's explanations because it was easier than challenging them. And beneath the anger was something else, a cold, patient determination, a willingness to wait, to work slowly, to build something solid before acting. I didn't want a confrontation. I didn't want to scream at my mother or guilt her into confession. I wanted something more complete than that. I wanted the truth documented, verified, made official. I wanted the record corrected, even if it took years. The life insurance policy appeared in March, 18 months after my grandmother's death. Rachel found it through a database search, a whole life policy issued in 1973 by Mutual of Hartford, with a death benefit of $150,000. The beneficiaries were listed as my mother and Uncle David, equal shares. Rachel called me the night she found it. The benefit was paid out in full on December 14th, 1 month after your grandmother died. There's no record of it in the estate settlement. I pulled out my spreadsheet, scrolled to the summary page. Nothing. My mother never mentioned a life insurance policy at the will reading, and it's not in any of the accounting she gave David. That's $75,000 each that wasn't distributed, or $150,000 that went somewhere else entirely. We were both quiet for a moment. This was different from the vague suspicions, the missing jewelry, the unexplained expenses. This was concrete, documentable, a specific asset that should have been split and wasn't. "What do we do with this?" I asked. "We verify it first, make absolutely sure the payment was made and where it went. Then we decide." Rachel filed a request with the insurance company using her status as a granddaughter and heir to obtain the payment records. It took 6 weeks and 2 follow-up calls, but eventually they sent her a letter confirming that the $150,000 death benefit had been paid via check to Linda Marie Whitmore as co-beneficiary and executor of the estate, to be distributed according to the terms of the policy and the deceased's will. "To be distributed," Rachel said when she showed me the letter. We were sitting in her apartment this time, a small 1-bedroom she shared with a roommate who worked night shifts. The apartment was tidy but spare. IKEA furniture, plants in mismatched pots, textbooks from her CPA exam stacked on the coffee table. That's specific language. The money wasn't paid solely to Linda. It was paid to her in her capacity as executor, with the understanding that she'd distribute it properly. But she didn't. Apparently not, unless she can show documentation that she gave David his half, which I'm guessing she can't. I thought about the Scottsdale condo, the Mercedes, the jewelry and the Facebook photos. She spent it. Probably. Or invested it somewhere we haven't found yet. Rachel opened her laptop, pulled up a file she'd been maintaining. Here's what we know she acquired in the 18 months after Grandma died. Scottsdale property, $485,000. Mercedes, $73,000. Renovations to the Scottsdale place, estimated $90,000 based on the contractor permits I found. That's $648,000 in documented spending. What did she and Richard have before the estate? Their primary residence, valued around $420,000, with a mortgage. Richard's business income, maybe $140,000 annually before taxes. Some retirement accounts. They weren't poor, but they weren't wealthy. And suddenly, they have enough cash to buy a second home outright and renovate it extensively. Rachel pulled up another document. I also found something else. Bank records. Not your grandmother's, but Linda's. My cousin works at the same bank Linda uses, and she saw a deposit. She's not supposed to tell me this, and if we ever use it legally, she'll deny everything. But in January, 2 months after Grandma died, Linda deposited a check for $87,000. The source was listed as estate settlement. That's oddly specific. If the estate wasn't settled yet, what was she settling? Exactly. The house didn't sell until April. The official estate distribution didn't happen until then. So where did $87,000 come from in January? I pulled out my notebook, flipped to a page where I'd been tracking my grandmother's accounts. The investment accounts. When Mr. Hutchins read the will, he said they totaled $680,000. When the estate closed, my mother claimed they'd dropped to $510,000 due to market losses and medical expenses. That's a $170,000 difference. Right. And $87,000 is almost exactly half of that. We looked at each other. She was giving David his half of money that should have still been in the estate, Rachel said slowly. She liquidated the accounts early, pocketed her share plus whatever she could justify as expenses. then gave David a portion to keep him quiet. But the accounts were joint. She had power of attorney. She could access them without anyone knowing. And by the time the estate officially closed, the money was already gone, spent, invested elsewhere, hidden. The final accounting just showed the lower number, and nobody questioned it because the money had already been distributed. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't carelessness or confusion. This was methodical, planned. My mother had used her access, her authority as executor, and my grandmother's failing health to systematically move money out of the estate and into her own accounts. And she'd done it in a way that looked almost legitimate if you didn't scrutinize too closely. "We need to know when she got power of attorney," I said, "and when she started accessing those accounts." Rachel nodded. "I'll see what I can find." Over the next 3 months, Rachel became my partner in a project that had no name, no clear endpoint, just a direction toward the truth. We met every 2 weeks, sometimes more often, always at her apartment or at libraries or coffee shops, never anywhere my mother might see us, might ask what we were doing. Rachel had a talent for finding information. She knew which databases to search, which public records were accessible, how to phrase requests so they'd be answered. She filed Freedom of Information requests for medical records, not my grandmother's protected health information, but facility billing records that showed when services were rendered and who paid. She traced property transfers, searched court records for any previous legal disputes, checked business filings to see if my mother or Richard had created any new LLCs or trusts around the time of the estate. I focused on the personal side. I went through boxes of my grandmother's papers that I'd taken from the house before the estate sale. Letters, cards, old checkbooks, address books. I found a letter my grandmother had written to me 6 years before her death, when I'd graduated from college. She'd written about her own mother, about family history, about the importance of passing things down. "The ring my mother wore," she'd written. "I want Rachel to have someday. She's so much like my mother was, steady, practical, kind. The ring should go to her." I showed the letter to Rachel. She read it silently, then folded it carefully and handed it back. "That's the 1919 ring, the one that disappeared. It proves Grandma wanted you to have it. It proves she said so in a letter. It doesn't prove Linda took it. For all we know, it got lost or stolen during the estate sale, or is sitting in a drawer somewhere. You don't believe that?" "No, but I'm an accountant. I believe what can be documented." In May, I drove to the county clerk's office and requested copies of the power of attorney documents my grandmother had signed. The clerk was a tired-looking woman in her 50s who processed my request without interest, took my payment, and told me to come back in 3 days. When I returned, she handed me a manila envelope. "Everything on file for Helen Marie Patterson, deceased 2023. I waited until I was in my car to open it. The documents were straightforward. Durable power of attorney for healthcare, durable power of attorney for finances, both signed on March 8, 2021, 29 months before my grandmother died. I read through them carefully. My mother was named as agent for both. Uncle David was listed as successor agent, to take over only if my mother was unable or unwilling to serve. The financial power of attorney was broad. It gave my mother authority to access all accounts, make transfers, buy and sell property, manage investments, pay bills, file taxes, everything. And it was effective immediately. My grandmother didn't have to be incapacitated for it to activate. The moment she signed, my mother had full legal access to her finances. I photographed every page and sent them to Rachel. She called me within an hour. This is dated 2 years before Grandma got sick. I know. Why would she sign over that much control while she was still healthy? My mother probably convinced her it was practical, in case something happened, so the accounts wouldn't be frozen. Did something happen? Not that I know of. Grandma was fine in 2021, still driving, still managing her own affairs. So Linda had access to everything for 29 months. If she was moving money, she could have been doing it the entire time. I sat in the car, staring at the documents. How do we find out what she did with that access? We need the account statements, all of them, going back to March 2021. My mother won't give those to us. No, but the banks have to keep records for 7 years. If we can get a court order, they'll have to produce them. That means going legal. Eventually, yes, but not yet. First, we keep gathering. When we do go legal, I want to have enough evidence that Linda can't deny anything. I want it airtight. I appreciated Rachel's caution. Part of me wanted to move faster, to confront my mother, to force this into the open. But Rachel was right. We needed to be sure. We needed documentation, corroboration, a case built carefully enough that it couldn't be dismissed or explained away. In June, I found someone who could testify about my grandmother's wishes. Mrs. Chen, an elderly neighbor who had lived next to my grandmother for 33 years. I'd remembered her from my Sunday visits. She'd sometimes come over to share vegetables from her garden or ask about my grandmother's health. After the funeral, she'd hugged me and said if I ever needed anything, to call. I called. She invited me to her house, served tea and almond cookies, asked about my life with genuine interest. When I finally brought up my grandmother, she grew somber. "Your grandmother was a wonderful woman," she said, "very organized, very particular about how things should be done." "Did she ever talk to you about her estate, about what she wanted to happen after she died?" Mrs. Chen hesitated. "Should I be telling you this?" "I'm trying to make sure her wishes were honored. Some things don't seem to have been handled the way she intended." "Ah." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "Your mother. What about her?" "Your grandmother loved Linda, of course, but she worried about her. She said Linda always wanted more than she had, always comparing herself to other people, wanting a bigger house, nicer things. Your grandmother said it made her sad because Linda had a good life, but she couldn't see it." "Did my grandmother say anything specific about the estate?" "She mentioned the jewelry several times. She had pieces she wanted to go to specific people. The pearl necklace to you, the wedding ring to Rachel, the emerald earrings to David's middle daughter. I can't remember her name." "Emma." "Yes, Emma. She said Emma had always admired those earrings." Mrs. Chen paused. She also said she was worried Linda would try to take control. This was maybe 6 months before she died. She said, "Linda's been very helpful, very attentive, but I sometimes wonder what she's writing down when I sign those papers." "What papers?" "I don't know. Things Linda would bring over. Bills to pay, documents to sign. Your grandmother's eyesight wasn't good at the end. She had to trust what Linda told her the papers said." I felt a chill. Did my grandmother seem confused? Like she didn't understand what she was signing? No, not confused, just tired and trusting. She trusted Linda because Linda was her daughter. Mrs. Chen looked at me with sad, knowing eyes. That's what daughters count on, isn't it? That their mothers will trust them. I asked if she'd be willing to write down what she remembered, sign and date it. She agreed. 2 days later, she mailed me a handwritten statement, 3 pages long, detailing conversations she'd had with my grandmother about the jewelry, about her wishes for the house, about her concerns regarding Linda's involvement. At the bottom, she'd signed her name and added, "I swear this is true and accurate to the best of my memory." Rachel and I met that week to review what we'd accumulated. We spread everything across her dining table: documents, statements, photographs, notes, timelines. "Here's what we can prove," Rachel said, moving papers into organized stacks. 1. Linda had power of attorney starting March 2021, 29 months before Grandma died. 2. A life insurance policy paid $150,000 to Linda as executor, and that money was never distributed to David or included in the estate accounting. 3. Linda made several large purchases totaling over $600,000 within 18 months of Grandma's death. 4. Investment accounts dropped by $170,000 between the will reading and the estate settlement, with vague explanations about market losses and medical expenses. She moved to another stack. Here's what we can reasonably infer, but can't yet prove. Linda was accessing Grandma's accounts during the power of attorney period and moving money into her own accounts. The medical expenses, she claimed, were inflated or fabricated. The estate sale proceeds were underreported. Jewelry and personal items were taken that should have gone to specific heirs. And here's what we know from testimony, I added, pointing to Mrs. Chen's statement, that my grandmother had specific wishes about distributing her jewelry and that she was concerned about my mother's control over her affairs toward the end. Rachel sat back. It's good. It's really good. But it's not enough for court. Not yet. We need the bank statements. We need proof of transfers, not just suspicious timing. We need documentation of what Linda actually did with the power of attorney. How do we get that? We hire a lawyer, file a petition to reopen the estate, request a forensic accounting, subpoena the records. It'll be expensive and slow, but it's the only way. I looked at the table covered in evidence of my mother's betrayal. 2 years of work, hundreds of hours, meticulous documentation, and we were still only at the beginning. Before we do that, I said, I want to talk to Uncle David. Really talk to him. Tell him everything we've found. He deserves to know, and if we're going to do this, I want his support. Rachel nodded. Okay, but be prepared for him to say no. He might not want to go through with it. I know. I called Uncle David that night and asked if I could visit. He sounded surprised, but agreed. The following Saturday, I drove to his house, the modest 3-bedroom ranch where he'd lived for 26 years. Margaret answered the door, offered me coffee, then excused herself to run errands. David and I sat in the living room, surrounded by family photos, his daughters at various ages, school pictures and graduations and weddings. I told him everything. I showed him the life insurance policy, the property records, the power of attorney documents, Mrs. Chen's statement. I walked him through the timeline, the missing money, the suspicious purchases. I showed him my spreadsheet with all the numbers, the gaps, the discrepancies. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. I knew, he said finally. Not the details, but I knew Linda took more than she should have. I knew it at the funeral, watching her work the room like she was the only one who'd lost anything. I knew it when she gave me that check in January and told me it was my advance on the estate. I knew it when the final accounting didn't match what Mom's will had said. Then why didn't you say something? He rubbed his face with both hands. Because I'm a coward. Because I didn't want to believe my own sister would steal from me. Because Margaret said we should just take what we got and be grateful and not cause problems. Because I've spent my whole life avoiding conflict, and I'm too old to change now. You're 53. That's old enough to know who you are. I'm not a fighter. I never have been. Linda knew that. That's why she did it. Because she knew I wouldn't challenge her. What if I challenge her? What if Rachel and I take this to court? David looked at me, his face weary. Then I'll support you. I won't lead it, but I'll support it. I'll testify if you need me to. I'll provide whatever documentation I have, but you need to understand. This will destroy our family. Whatever relationship we have left with Linda, it'll be gone. Holidays, weddings, funerals. We'll never be in the same room again without lawyers present. The family's already destroyed. We just haven't acknowledged it yet. Maybe. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at his small, neat yard. Your grandmother used to say that Linda was hungry. That's the word she used, hungry. Not for food, but for more. More money, more status, more recognition. She said it made Linda unhappy. That hunger because it could never be satisfied. There was always someone with more. He turned back to me. If you do this, if you take her to court and prove she stole from the estate, it won't make her less hungry. It'll just make her meaner. I know. And you're okay with that? I thought about my grandmother's house, emptied and sold, about the jewelry that had disappeared, about Rachel not getting to say goodbye, about the systematic patient theft that my mother had executed while her own mother lay dying. Yes, I said, I'm okay with that. David nodded slowly. Then I'm with you. Tell me what you need. I left his house 2 hours later with a box of documents, estate papers, correspondence with my mother, bank statements from the account where he'd deposited his share, records of every interaction he'd had with the estate process. It wasn't much, but it was something. And it was his permission, his blessing, to move forward. Rachel and I spent July organizing everything into a comprehensive file. We created a timeline that covered 4 years, from March 2021, when my mother received power of attorney, through my grandmother's illness and death, through the estate settlement to the present. We documented every asset we could identify, every discrepancy, every suspicious transaction. We compiled witness statements, public records, photographs, correspondence. By the end of the month, we had a 3-inch binder. Rachel had indexed everything, cross-referenced, color-coded. It was beautiful in its way. The architecture of evidence, built carefully over 2 years. Now what? I asked. Now we find a lawyer who specializes in estate litigation, someone who's willing to take on a complicated case that might not pay off for years, someone who believes in holding executors accountable. Do you know anyone like that? Rachel smiled slightly. I've been researching. I have 3 names. We'll meet with all of them, see who takes us seriously. We started making appointments. The first lawyer, a man in his 60s with an office that smelled like old paper, listened to our summary for 20 minutes, then told us we didn't have a case. Power of attorney gives broad authority, he said. Unless you can prove actual theft, money transferred directly from your grandmother's accounts to your mother's for her personal use, it's just family disagreement. Courts don't like to second-guess executors. The second lawyer, a woman in her 40s who specialized in elder financial abuse, was more interested. She reviewed our documentation, asked detailed questions, made notes. This is compelling, she said, but it's also resource-intensive. We're talking depositions, forensic accountants, possibly years of litigation. Can you afford that? We'll find a way, Rachel said. It could cost $50,000 or more, maybe much more, and there's no guarantee you'll recover anything. We thanked her and left. In the parking lot, Rachel and I looked at each other. We can't afford this, I said. Not up front, but maybe contingency? If we win, the lawyer takes a percentage of what we recover? Do estate lawyers do contingency? Some do. Let's try the third one. The third lawyer was younger, late 30s, with an office in a converted warehouse and a reputation for taking on challenging cases. His name was Michael Brenner, and he listened to our entire presentation without interrupting. 90 minutes of evidence, timeline, documentation. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "How much do you think your mother took?" he asked. "At minimum, $150,000 from the life insurance policy," Rachel said. "Probably another $100,000 to $200,000 from early liquidation of investment accounts and underreported estate sale proceeds. Possibly more if we can access her financial records and trace other transfers. So we're talking $250,000 to $350,000 in misappropriated funds, at minimum. And your grandmother's estate was worth approximately $2 million total? Yes, he nodded slowly. Here's what I think. You have enough evidence to justify reopening the estate and requesting a forensic accounting. That's our first step. We file a petition with probate court, argue that the executor's accounting was incomplete or fraudulent, and request a formal investigation. The court appoints an independent accountant who examines everything. If they find what you think they'll find, then we move to the next phase, litigation to recover the funds. How long does that take? First phase, 6 to 12 months. Full litigation, if it comes to that, 2 to 4 years, maybe longer. Rachel and I were both silent. "I'll take this on contingency," Brenner continued. 33% of whatever we recover, plus costs which you'll need to front, filing fees, accountant fees, deposition costs, probably $15,000 to start. That's less than the other lawyer quoted. Because I think you have a real case, and because I don't like it when executors steal from their own families. It's particularly egregious." He looked at both of us. "But you need to understand what you're signing up for. This will be adversarial. Your mother will hire her own lawyers. She'll claim everything was legitimate, that she has documentation, that you're just bitter and greedy. She'll make you look bad if she can, and even if we win, you may not get back everything she took. Some of it's probably spent, gone." "We understand," I said. "And you're both sure? Because once we file, there's no going back. This becomes public record. Everyone will know." Rachel and I looked at each other. 2 years of work sat in the binder on Brenner's desk. 2 years of patience, documentation, careful investigation. We were standing at a threshold, and once we crossed it, everything would change. "We're sure," Rachel said. Brenner nodded. "Okay, let's go to war." We filed the petition to reopen the estate on September 12th, 2 years and 10 months after my grandmother's death. Michael Brenner drafted a 23-page document outlining our concerns, attaching key evidence, and requesting that the probate court appoint an independent forensic accountant to review the estate's financial records. The language was careful, technical, avoiding inflammatory accusations while making clear that significant irregularities existed. The court scheduled a preliminary hearing for November. In the meantime, my mother had 30 days to respond to our petition. Her response arrived on day 29. It was dismissive and brief, a 4-page letter from her attorney, a man named Gerald Huxley, who specialized in estate litigation and whose letterhead featured an office address in the city's most expensive business district. The letter stated that Mrs. Whitmore had fulfilled her duties as executor with complete fidelity, that all estate assets had been properly accounted for and distributed, and that this petition was nothing more than a baseless attempt by disgruntled heirs to extract additional funds to which they had no entitlement. The letter concluded by noting that Mrs. Whitmore reserved the right to seek sanctions against the petitioners for filing a frivolous claim. "That's standard," Brenner said when I called him, panicked by the word sanctions. "They're trying to intimidate you. Ignore it. The court will decide if there's merit, not Huxley." "She hired an expensive lawyer." "Of course she did. She has something to protect." The preliminary hearing was perfunctory. A judge, a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a chain, reviewed both filings, asked Brenner a few clarifying questions about what specifically we were alleging, and then granted our request for a forensic accounting. She appointed a CPA named Robert Fielding, who specialized in estate fraud investigations, and ordered both parties to provide him with complete financial documentation, going back to March 2021. "Mr. Fielding will have 90 days to complete his review," the judge said. "At that time, he'll submit a report to the court and will reconvene to discuss next steps. Mrs. Whitmore, you are ordered to provide Mr. Fielding with all bank statements, investment records, receipts, and correspondence related to the estate. Failure to comply will result in sanctions." My mother sat 2 rows behind her attorney. She didn't look at me during the hearing. She wore a cream-colored suit and pearl earrings, expensive, understated. Her face was composed, neutral. If she was worried, she didn't show it. After the hearing in the courthouse hallway, she finally approached me. Rachel had stayed home. She wasn't a named party to the petition, just a witness, and Brenner had advised her to maintain distance for now. So it was just me, standing near the elevator, when my mother walked over. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said. Her voice was quiet, controlled. "What do you hope to accomplish?" "I want the truth about what happened to Grandma's estate." "You got your bequest. Everyone got what they were entitled to. This is just greed." "It's not about my bequest. It's about the life insurance policy you never mentioned. The investment accounts that lost $170,000 with no documentation. The jewelry that disappeared. Everything was handled properly. The accountant will confirm that, and then you'll have wasted everyone's time and money on nothing. Then you have nothing to worry about." She studied me for a moment, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not anger exactly, but something colder. Calculation. You know what your grandmother used to say about you? That you were judgmental, that you always thought you were better than everyone else, smarter, more principled. She found it exhausting. Grandma never said that. She did. She said it to me many times. She said you made her feel inadequate, the way you'd visit and inspect everything, like you were checking up on her. I felt the words land, felt them burrow in even as I knew they were designed to hurt. My mother was skilled at this, finding the vulnerable place, the doubt, and pressing exactly there. I don't believe you, I said. Believe what you want. But when this is over, when you've embarrassed yourself and lost and spent thousands of dollars on lawyers for nothing, remember that I tried to stop you. I tried to spare you this. She walked away. I stood by the elevator shaking slightly until Brenner appeared and steered me out of the courthouse. Don't engage with her, he said. That's what she wants. She wants to make this emotional, make you doubt yourself. Don't give her that. She said my grandmother thought I was judgmental. She's lying. And even if she wasn't, it doesn't matter. We're not here to relitigate your relationship with your grandmother. We're here to determine if your mother stole from the estate. Stay focused on that. Robert Fielding, the forensic accountant, turned out to be a meticulous man in his early 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He met with us in Brenner's office 2 weeks after his appointment to discuss the scope of his investigation. I've submitted document requests to both parties, he said, consulting a notepad. I've asked for complete banking records for Mrs. Patterson, your grandmother, from March 2021 through the date of death. All investment account statements, credit card statements, checkbooks. I've asked Mrs. Whitmore for the same regarding any accounts where she was joint holder or had power of attorney. I've also requested all estate sale records, appraisal documents, and correspondence related to the estate administration. Will she provide all that? I asked. She's required to. If she doesn't, the court can compel production or draw negative inferences from her refusal. Most people comply eventually. They might delay, claim documents are lost, but ultimately they provide something. What are you looking for specifically? Fielding ticked items off on his fingers. Unusual transfers, especially large ones or ones to non-commercial payees, checks written to cash, ATM withdrawals that don't match the decedent's patterns, changes in spending after the power of attorney was granted, any evidence that Mrs. Whitmore was using her mother's funds for personal expenses. I'm also looking at the timing. Did transfers accelerate as Mrs. Patterson's health declined? That's often a sign of exploitation. How long will this take? I have 90 days from when I receive the documents. Banks take time to compile records, especially if we're going back several years. I'd estimate I'll have everything by mid-January, and then I'll need 6 to 8 weeks to analyze it all. My report should be ready by late March. We were looking at 5 more months of waiting, 5 months of my mother's lawyer sending hostile letters, of court dates and status conferences, of my life existing in this strange, suspended state where I went to work, saw friends, maintained routines, while underneath it all, this slow-moving machinery ground forward. Rachel called me most evenings during this period. We'd talk about the case sometimes, but more often about other things. Her job, her dating life, books we were reading, television shows. The case had made us close in a way that felt both natural and strange. We'd never been particularly close as cousins, but now we talked nearly every day, bound together by this project, this shared determination. My dad asked me if I thought it was worth it, Rachel said one night in December. All the stress, the money, the family drama. He said even if we win, we're just getting back money that Grandma probably would have wanted Linda to have anyway. Do you think that's true? No, I think Grandma wanted things split fairly. I think she trusted Linda because Linda was her daughter, and then Linda exploited that trust. But I also think Dad's tired. He wants it to be over. Are you tired? She was quiet for a moment. I'm angry, and anger is energizing for a while. But yeah, sometimes I'm tired too. Sometimes I think about just dropping it, Letting Linda keep whatever she took, moving on with my life? But you won't. No, because if we drop it, Linda wins, and she needs to know she can't just take things because she's powerful or connected or willing to be ruthless. Someone has to hold her accountable. For accuracy, I said, echoing her words from 2 years earlier. For accuracy, she agreed. In January, Fielding's document requests started bearing fruit. Banks sent statements, boxes of them, hundreds of pages of transactions. My mother's attorney provided some records, though Brenner noted they seemed incomplete. She gave us account statements but not images of the actual checks, he said. Statements show that checks were written, but not who they were to or what they were for. Fielding's asked for the check images specifically. More delays, more back and forth. Huxley, my mother's attorney, argued that check images were unnecessarily invasive, that the statements were sufficient. Brenner countered that without check images, we couldn't verify the legitimacy of the expenses my mother claimed. The judge sided with us. My mother was ordered to provide check images within 15 days. When they arrived, Fielding spent 3 weeks analyzing them. Then he called a meeting. We gathered in Brenner's conference room. Me, Rachel, Uncle David, who'd taken a day off work to attend, Brenner, and Fielding. Fielding had brought his laptop and a projector. He set up methodically, connecting cables, adjusting the focus, pulling up spreadsheets. "I want to walk you through what I've found," he said. "This is preliminary. My full report won't be ready for another month, but I thought you should see the major patterns." He pulled up the first image. This is Mrs. Patterson's primary checking account at First National Bank. In March 2021, when Mrs. Whitmore received power of attorney, the balance was $47,000. Over the next 30 months, until Mrs. Patterson's death in November 2023, there were regular deposits, Social Security, pension payments, investment dividends. Total deposits in that period, approximately $156,000. He clicked to the next slide. There were also regular withdrawals. Some were clearly legitimate: utility bills, property taxes, insurance premiums, medical expenses. But there were also checks written to Linda Whitmore, or marked cash, totaling $83,000 over those 30 months. "What were those checks for?" Uncle David asked. "According to the notations, various expenses, repairs, groceries, medical supplies, caretaking." But when I cross-reference these with actual bills paid, the utility companies, the contractors, the medical supply companies, the amounts don't match. For example, in June 2022, Mrs. Whitmore wrote herself a check for $4,500, marked roof repairs. But the actual invoice from the roofing company was $2,100. The remaining $2,400 has no documented purpose. Fielding clicked through more examples. A check for $3,000 marked medical equipment when the wheelchair rental company charged $800. A check for $2,500 for home health aid when the AIDS agency billed $1,200 directly. Over and over, the pattern repeated. Expenses that were real but inflated, with the difference going into my mother's pocket. "This is just the checking account," Fielding said. "The investment accounts show a similar pattern. Mrs. Whitmore had online access to your grandmother's accounts at Merrill Lynch. Starting in September 2022, about 14 months before Mrs. Patterson died, there were systematic transfers from the investment accounts to the checking account, and then to Mrs. Whitmore personally." He showed us the timeline. September 2022, $15,000 transferred. October, $12,000. November, $18,000. Month after month, money moving from investments to checking to my mother, always in amounts large enough to matter, but small enough that no single transfer was obviously fraudulent. "By the time Mrs. Patterson died," Fielding said, approximately $180,000 had been transferred out of the investment accounts using this method. When the estate was settled, Mrs. Whitmore attributed the reduction in account value to market losses and medical expenses. But the market was actually up during this period. The S&P gained about 11%. Mrs. Patterson's investments should have grown, not shrunk. Uncle David was very still, his face pale. She stole $180,000? That's what the transfers suggest. I'm still verifying, cross-referencing with tax returns and other documentation. But yes, it appears Mrs. Whitmore systematically transferred funds from her mother's accounts to her own, using her power of attorney access. What about the life insurance? I asked. Fielding nodded. The $150,000 policy. It was paid to Mrs. Whitmore as executor on December 14, 2023. She deposited it in her personal account. There's no record of her distributing half to Mr. Patterson, as required by the policy terms. When I asked her attorney about this, he said Mrs. Whitmore considered the life insurance payout to be part of her executor's compensation for managing the estate. Can she do that? Rachel asked. No, Brenner said flatly. Executors' fees are calculated based on estate value and are typically 2 to 3% of the total. Given the estate size, a reasonable fee would be $40,000 to $60,000. You can't just claim an entire life insurance policy as your fee. Fielding continued through his presentation. The estate sale proceeds, which my mother had reported as $23,000, appeared to actually have totaled closer to $47,000 based on the estate sale company's records and credit card receipts from buyers. The jewelry that was supposed to go to specific heirs, he'd found invoices showing my mother had sold several pieces through a private dealer for $31,000, none of which was reported to the estate. By the time Fielding finished, we'd been in the conference room for 2 hours. The numbers on the projector screen were stark, damning. Misappropriated or unaccounted funds. Inflated expense reimbursements, $83,000. Investment account transfers, $180,000. Life insurance policy, $150,000. Estate sale underreporting, $24,000. Jewelry sales, $31,000. Total, $468,000. Uncle David put his head in his hands. Rachel sat very still, her jaw tight. I felt something cold and vindicating settle in my chest. We'd been right. For 3 years we'd suspected, documented, investigated, and we'd been right. This is more than I expected, Brenner said quietly. This is substantial fraud. What happens now? I asked. Fielding completes his report. We submit it to the court. The judge reviews it and decides whether to order Mrs. Whitmore to repay the funds. She'll have the opportunity to challenge the findings, provide alternative explanations. But with documentation this clear, he trailed off, shook his head. It's going to be very difficult for her to explain this away. Will she go to jail? Rachel asked. Unlikely. This is civil, not criminal. The remedy is financial. She'll be ordered to repay what she took, plus interest, plus potentially our legal fees and costs. She won't be prosecuted unless law enforcement decides to pursue charges separately, which they might not do given the family context. Uncle David finally looked up. His eyes were wet. I can't believe she did this. I mean, I knew she took some, but this much? While Mom was dying? She had access and opportunity, Fielding said, not unkindly, and she used both. This is unfortunately common in estate situations, family members with power of attorney or executor authority who help themselves to funds. Most of it never gets discovered because other heirs don't have the resources or knowledge to investigate. We were lucky, I said. Rachel knew what to look for. You were persistent, Fielding corrected. Most people give up long before this point. We left the meeting in a daze. Uncle David hugged me in the parking lot, something he'd never done before. Thank you, he said, for not giving up, for caring enough to fight. Rachel and I went to a bar near her apartment. We ordered drinks, whiskey for her, wine for me, and sat in a corner booth, not talking much. The vindication felt less satisfying than I'd expected. Yes, we'd been right. Yes, we had proof. But the numbers Fielding had shown us represented my mother's systematic exploitation of her own dying mother. The cold calculation of it was hard to hold in my mind. "Are you going to tell her?" Rachel asked finally. "Your mom, before the report goes to the court." What would I say? That we know, that she has a chance to settle before this becomes public record. Brenner said she might be more willing to negotiate if she knows how bad the findings are. "Do you think she'll settle?" Rachel swirled her whiskey. "I think she'll fight. People like Linda don't admit fault. They double down, blame everyone else, play victim. She'll say Grandma wanted her to have the money. She'll say the transfers were loans or gifts. She'll say we're persecuting her. Probably. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe seeing the actual numbers, the documentation, will make her realize she can't win. Maybe she'll want to avoid the publicity." I thought about my mother in the courthouse hallway, her controlled fury, her certainty that she'd done nothing wrong. She won't settle. She'll make us take it all the way. Then we take it all the way. We drank in silence for a while. The bar was filling up with after-work crowds, young professionals laughing and ordering appetizers, normal people living normal lives, unburdened by family betrayals and forensic accountants. "Can I tell you something?" Rachel said. "I'm glad we did this, even if it takes years more, even if we end up getting less back than she took. I'm glad someone documented what she did, that there's a record now. That's what matters to me." "Accuracy," I said. "Accuracy," she agreed. Fielding's final report was submitted to the court on March 28th, 5 months after his appointment. It was 73 pages long, meticulously detailed, with exhibits and supporting documentation that added another 200 pages. Brenner filed it with a motion requesting that the court order my mother to repay $468,000 to the estate, to be distributed to the proper heirs, plus interest calculated from the dates of the improper transfers, plus our legal fees and Fielding's fees. The court scheduled a hearing for May. My mother's attorney requested an extension to respond to the report. The judge granted 30 days. In late April, Huxley's response arrived, a 40-page document disputing nearly every finding in Fielding's report. The response argued that all transfers were legitimate gifts from Mrs. Patterson to her daughter, that Mrs. Patterson had wanted Mrs. Whitmore to have the money, that the expense reimbursements were accurate, and any discrepancies were due to additional services Mrs. Whitmore had provided without billing. It argued that the life insurance policy was intended as executor's compensation, that Mrs. Patterson had told Mrs. Whitmore this verbally before her death. It argued that the estate sale proceeds were accurately reported, and any suggestion otherwise was based on speculation and incomplete records. "They're not even trying to be credible," Brenner said when we reviewed the response. "They're just throwing everything at the wall to create confusion. But none of this refutes the documentary evidence. Fielding has bank records showing exactly where the money went. They can claim it was all gifts, but gifts of this size should have been reported for tax purposes. Were they? I don't know. I'll find out. If your mother didn't report these as gifts on her tax returns, that's additional evidence they weren't actually gifts. You don't hide legitimate gifts from the IRS." The May hearing was longer than the preliminary one had been. Both sides presented arguments. Fielding testified about his methodology and findings. Huxley cross-examined him, trying to poke holes in the analysis, suggesting alternative explanations for each transaction. Fielding remained calm, factual, unshakable. My mother testified too. She took the stand and described the burden of caring for her dying mother, the hours spent managing medical appointments and medications and household affairs, the emotional toll of watching her mother decline. She said the money she'd taken, she didn't use the word taken, she said received, was compensation for this caregiving, which her mother had wanted her to have. "Did your mother tell you verbally that you could take this money?" Brenner asked during cross-examination. "She said I should be compensated for my time. She appreciated everything I was doing." "Did she tell you to take $180,000 from her investment accounts?" "She told me to handle things. That's what power of attorney means. You handle things." "Did she tell you to keep the entire life insurance policy and not give your brother his share?" The life insurance was always intended for me. David got plenty from the estate. Did your mother tell you verbally that the life insurance was solely for you, contrary to what the policy stated? She didn't need to tell me. I knew. Brenner let that sit. You knew, despite the policy naming both you and your brother as equal beneficiaries, that your mother wanted you to have all of it. Yes. And you have no written documentation of this wish, no letter, no email, no amendment to the policy. It was understood between us. Understood. Based on your interpretation of conversations you had with your dying mother. Objection, Huxley said. Argumentative. The judge sustained it. But the point was made. My mother's defense rested entirely on claimed verbal agreements that couldn't be verified, contradicting written documents and established legal procedures. The hearing lasted all day. When it ended, the judge said she'd issue a written ruling within 60 days. We filed out of the courtroom exhausted. My mother left immediately, not looking at any of us. In the courthouse lobby, Uncle David approached me. Do you think we'll win? I don't know. The evidence is strong, but she's claiming everything was legitimate. It comes down to whether the judge believes documentary evidence or my mother's testimony about Grandma's verbal wishes. Your mother's a good liar, David said quietly. She always has been. She believes her own lies. That's what makes her convincing. Rachel joined us. Either way, it's on the record now, what she did. A forensic accountant documented it, and it's in a court file that anyone can access. That's something. We stood together in the lobby, 3 people bound by blood and betrayal and the slow machinery of justice. Outside, spring was in full bloom, the city bright and warm. But inside the courthouse, in the files and transcripts and sworn testimony, the truth was being assembled piece by piece. And whatever the judge decided, that truth would remain, permanent, documented, for accuracy. The judge's ruling arrived on July 9th, 63 days after the hearing. Brenner called me at work, his voice carefully neutral. We won, mostly. I sat down at my desk, my legs suddenly unsteady. What does mostly mean? The judge found that your mother breached her fiduciary duty as executor and improperly used her power of attorney to transfer funds to herself. She's ordered to repay $412,000 to the estate, plus interest. That brings it to about $438,000 total. She's also responsible for our legal fees and Fielding's fees, which total about $67,000 so far. That's $500,000. Yes, the judge rejected some of our claims. She found that about $56,000 of the expense reimbursements could be reasonably attributed to legitimate caretaking costs. And she didn't include some of the jewelry sales because we couldn't definitively prove your mother sold them versus them being lost or stolen by someone else. But the bulk of our case was upheld. The investment account transfers, the life insurance policy, the estate sale underreporting, all found to be improper. When does she have to pay? She has 90 days to repay the full amount. If she doesn't, we can start collection proceedings, liens on property, wage garnishment, that kind of thing. But I suspect she'll try to appeal first. How long would an appeal take? A year, maybe 2. She'd have to post a bond for the judgment amount while the appeal is pending. Most appeals courts are reluctant to overturn detailed factual findings like this, but it's her right to try. I thanked Brenner and hung up. Then I sat at my desk, staring at my computer screen without seeing it. 3 years. 3 years of investigation, documentation, legal proceedings. And we'd won. The judge had ruled, in careful legal language, that my mother had stolen from her own dying mother. It was in the record now. Official. True. I called Rachel. She'd already heard from Brenner. Are you okay? She asked. I don't know. I thought I'd feel more something. Relief or vindication or satisfaction. But mostly I just feel tired. That's normal. We've been carrying this for 3 years. It doesn't just evaporate because a judge ruled in our favor. Has anyone told my mother yet? Huxley will have informed her, or she might have checked the court docket herself. The ruling was filed this morning. I wondered what my mother had done when she heard, whether she'd cried or raged or simply sat very still, calculating her next move. I wondered if she felt any guilt, any remorse, or whether she still believed, in some deep part of herself, that she'd done nothing wrong, that she'd earned that money through her caregiving, that the court had made a terrible mistake. Uncle David called that evening. His voice was thick. "I talked to Linda today." "She called you?" "I called her. I thought, I don't know what I thought, that maybe she'd apologize, that we could find some way past this." "What did she say?" "She said the judge was biased, that you and Rachel poisoned the case with lies, that she's going to appeal and win, and then she's going to sue all of us for defamation. She said Mom would be ashamed of me for going along with this, for letting you drag the family through court." He paused. Then she hung up. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." I knew what she'd say. I think I needed to hear it anyway, to confirm that there's no reconciliation possible, that this is just who she is. "Are you okay with that?" He was quiet for a long moment. "No, but I'm dealing with it. Margaret thinks I should see a therapist, process the grief of losing both my mother and my sister. She's probably right." We talked for a few more minutes, then said goodbye. After we hung up, I thought about what he'd said, the grief of losing both my mother and my sister, because that's what this was, a death of sorts. The relationship I'd had with my mother, however distant and cordial it had been, was gone. We'd never speak again except through lawyers. We'd never share a holiday meal, never exchange birthday cards, never navigate the ordinary awkwardness of adult family relationships. Whatever small connection had existed was severed, permanently, and I'd chosen that. I'd known it would happen, and I'd chosen it anyway, because the alternative, letting her theft stand unchallenged, letting her rewrite history, letting her win through the sheer force of her willingness to be ruthless, was worse. My mother filed her notice of appeal on September 28th, 3 days before the 90-day payment deadline. The appeal automatically stayed the judgment, meaning she didn't have to pay while the appeal was pending. But she did have to post a super sedeas bond, essentially insurance that guaranteed she'd pay if she lost the appeal. The bond amount was $525,000, covering the judgment plus estimated additional interest and costs. "She'll have to use the Scottsdale condo as collateral," Brenner explained, "or pull from her retirement accounts. The bond company won't just give her $500,000 in credit without security." "Could she lose the condo?" "If she loses the appeal and doesn't pay, yes. The bond company would seize whatever collateral she posted. That's the risk she's taking." The appeal process was slower than the trial had been. My mother's appellate attorney filed an opening brief in December, 127 pages arguing that the trial judge had erred in multiple ways, misapplied the law, ignored evidence, made findings unsupported by the record. We had 60 days to file a response brief. Brenner drafted it methodically, responding to each argument, citing case law, walking through the evidence again in excruciating detail. The response brief was filed in February. My mother's attorney filed a reply brief in March. Then we waited for the appellate court to schedule oral arguments. During this time, the winter and spring of the appeal, my life existed in a strange duality. On the surface, everything was normal. I went to work, where I'd been promoted to a management position with more responsibility and better pay. I dated someone briefly, a man I met through friends, though it didn't last past a few months. I traveled to Portland for a long weekend, visited museums, ate at restaurants, took photos that I posted online like anyone else living an ordinary life. But underneath the surface, the case was always there. I'd check the court docket every few days, looking for updates, status changes, any indication of movement. Rachel and I still talked regularly, though less about the case now and more about our lives. She'd been promoted too, to senior accountant, and was studying for her CPA exam. She'd started dating someone seriously, a man named Trevor who worked in IT and seemed kind. Uncle David had started therapy, as Margaret had suggested. He told me it was helping. I'm working through a lot of stuff about Linda, about our childhood, about Mom. The therapist says I have a pattern of avoiding conflict and letting aggressive people dominate. Which, yeah, I knew that. But it's helpful to understand why, where it comes from. Is it changing anything? I'm getting better at setting boundaries, at saying no. Margaret's noticed. She says I seem less defeated. In April, the appellate court scheduled oral arguments for June 15th. Each side would have 30 minutes to present their case before a 3-judge panel. Brenner spent weeks preparing, anticipating questions, refining his arguments. I asked if I should attend. He said it wasn't necessary, that oral arguments rarely changed outcomes. The judges had already read the briefs and formed preliminary opinions, but I could come if I wanted to. I went. Rachel came too, and Uncle David. We sat in the back of the courtroom, a modern space with high ceilings and wood paneling, and watched lawyers argue the case that had consumed 4 years of our lives. Huxley, my mother's attorney, went first. He argued that the trial judge had failed to properly consider the context of Mrs. Whitmore's caretaking, the substantial time and effort she'd devoted to her mother's care, the emotional and physical toll it had taken. He argued that the transfers weren't theft, but reasonable compensation for services rendered, and that Mrs. Patterson would have wanted her daughter to be compensated. He argued that the life insurance policy's language was ambiguous, that the phrase, "to be distributed according to the terms of the policy," didn't necessarily mean equal distribution to both beneficiaries, that it could mean distribution according to the executor's judgment about what was fair given each heir's contributions. The judges asked sharp questions. Mr. Huxley, your client transferred $180,000 from her mother's investment accounts to her own accounts over 18 months. Did she report these as income? Did she pay taxes on them? The transfers were internal family transactions, Your Honor. Tax reporting requirements. Did she report them? Yes or no? I don't believe she reported them as income. No. But that doesn't mean... If these were legitimate compensation, as you argue, they should have been reported as income. The fact that she didn't report them suggests she knew they weren't legitimate. Huxley tried to recover, arguing that tax reporting was a separate issue, that it didn't prove the transfers were improper. But the damage was done. I watched the judges' faces, 2 women, 1 man, all in their 50s or 60s, and saw skepticism. Brenner's argument was crisper, more focused. He walked the court through the documentary evidence, the bank records, the check images, the investment transfers. He noted that every written document contradicted my mother's claimed verbal agreements. The life insurance policy specified equal distribution. The investment accounts were in my grandmother's name, not joint accounts. The power of attorney granted authority to manage assets, not to transfer them to oneself. This isn't a case about family disagreement or ambiguous language, Brenner said. It's about an executor who systematically looted her mother's estate, using the access she'd been given as a trusted fiduciary. The trial court correctly found this to be a breach of duty, and that finding is amply supported by the record. The judges asked fewer questions of Brenner. They seemed satisfied with his answers, ready to move on. When both sides had finished, the presiding judge thanked the attorneys and said the court would issue its decision in due course. The whole proceeding had lasted 90 minutes. We filed out into the hallway. Brenner was cautiously optimistic. I think it went well. The tax question caught Huxley off guard, and he didn't have a good answer. That'll be in the judges' minds when they deliberate. How long until they decide? Could be 2 months, could be 6. Appellate courts move slowly. My mother emerged from the courtroom with Huxley. She saw us standing in the hallway and stopped. For a moment, we all stood there. Me, Rachel, Uncle David on one side, my mother and her attorney on the other. 4 years of investigation and litigation crystallized in that moment of silence. Then my mother spoke. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but there was something raw underneath it. I hope you're proud of yourselves. dragging your own family through the courts, making everything public, humiliating me." "You humiliated yourself," Rachel said. "We just documented it." "You don't know what you're talking about. You weren't there. You didn't see how much I did for her, how hard I worked. None of you helped. You all just stood back and let me handle everything, and now you want to punish me for it." "You took $400,000, I said. "That's not punishment, that's accountability." My mother laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Accountability? You sound like a child, like someone who still believes the world is fair, that good people get rewarded and bad people get punished. It's not like that, you'll learn." "Maybe I already have," I said. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she turned and walked away, Huxley following. We watched her go, her straight back, her measured steps, her refusal to show any weakness or doubt. "She really believes it," Uncle David said quietly. "She believes she did nothing wrong." "I know." We left the courthouse and went to lunch at a cafe nearby. The conversation was subdued. We'd watched lawyers argue about my mother's theft, about my grandmother's estate, about money and documents and fiduciary duty. But underneath all that legal language was a simpler truth. A daughter had exploited her dying mother, and her own children were holding her accountable. The mechanics of that accountability, the briefs and hearings and judges, felt both necessary and insufficient. Justice was being done, slowly and imperfectly, but it couldn't undo what had been taken. It couldn't restore trust or repair relationships or bring my grandmother back. The appellate court issued its decision on September 3rd, nearly 3 months after oral arguments. The decision was unanimous. In a 28-page opinion, the court affirmed the trial court's findings in all respects. It held that Mrs. Whitmore had breached her fiduciary duties, that the transfers were not legitimate compensation or gifts, and that the trial court had correctly calculated the amount to be repaid. The court added one additional finding. It noted that Mrs. Whitmore's failure to report the transfers as income on her tax returns was evidence of consciousness of wrongdoing and supported the conclusion that she had known the transfers were improper. With the appeal denied, my mother had 30 days to pay the full judgment amount, now grown to $461,000 with additional interest. If she didn't pay, we could begin collection proceedings. Brenner called to give me the news. "This is it," he said. "No more appeals. She has to pay." "Will she?" "She'll have to liquidate assets. The Scottsdale condo, probably, maybe other investments. But yes, she'll pay. If she doesn't, we can force a sale of her property, and she knows that." "How long will it take?" "A few months. She'll try to get the best price she can for the condo, negotiate with creditors, minimize the damage. But by the end of the year, you and your uncle should receive distributions from the recovered funds." I thanked him and sat with the news. 4 years. 4 years from the preliminary hearing to the appellate decision. 4 years of documentation, investigation, legal proceedings, waiting. And now it was done. The judgment was final. My mother would repay what she'd taken, and the estate would be corrected. Rachel called an hour later. "We did it. Yeah. I keep waiting to feel happy about it, victorious. But mostly I just feel empty." "Me too." Trevor asked me if it was worth it, all the time and energy and stress. I told him yes, because the alternative was letting Linda get away with it. But I also wonder what these 4 years would have been like if we'd just let it go, if we'd moved on. Would you have been able to move on? Probably not. I'd have spent 4 years being angry with no outlet for it. At least this way the anger had a purpose. We talked for a while longer, not saying much of substance, just being present with each other in the strange anticlimax of victory. When we hung up, I went for a walk. It was early September, the air just beginning to cool, the light taking on that golden quality of late summer. I walked through my neighborhood, past houses with front yards and kids playing and dogs barking, ordinary domestic scenes. I thought about my grandmother, about whether she would have wanted this. whether she would have been glad we held my mother accountable, or whether she would have been horrified by the family rupture, by the years of legal warfare. I'd never know. But I had to believe, that truth mattered. That exploitation shouldn't go unchallenged, even when the exploiter was family, especially then. My mother listed the Scottsdale condo for sale in late September. It sold in November for $510,000. After the mortgage and selling costs, she netted about $470,000. She paid the judgment in full on December 2nd, 5 years and 1 month after my grandmother's death. The recovered funds were distributed to the estate's heirs according to the original will proportions. Uncle David received $230,500, which he split among his 3 daughters, setting up education funds for his future grandchildren. I received the same amount. I put most of it in savings, but I also made a donation to the hospice organization that had cared for my grandmother in her final months, and I established a small scholarship at her high school in her name, for students pursuing careers in nursing or teaching, fields my grandmother had valued. Rachel received the corrected bequest amount from the jewelry sales my mother had underreported, about $8,000. She used it to pay off student loans. The jewelry itself, the specific pieces my grandmother had wanted specific people to have, was never recovered. The 1919 wedding ring, the emerald earrings, the pearl necklace. My mother claimed she didn't have them, that they'd been lost or sold years ago, and we couldn't prove otherwise. Some thefts, I learned, couldn't be remedied. Some losses were permanent. In January, 6 years after my grandmother's death, I received a letter. It came to my apartment, handwritten envelope, no return address. I opened it carefully. The letter was from my mother, 2 pages written in her precise cursive. I'm writing this not because I think you'll care, but because I need to say it. You destroyed my life. You and Rachel and David. You took everything I built, everything I worked for, and you tore it down. You made me sell my home. You humiliated me in front of judges and lawyers and anyone who reads those court records. You turned my own brother against me. For what? For money you didn't need? For some abstract principle? I want you to know that I don't regret what I did. Mom wanted me to have that money. She told me 100 times how grateful she was for my care, how she didn't know what she'd do without me. The courts don't understand that. They just see numbers and rules and procedures. They don't see the reality of caregiving, the sacrifice. You'll probably think you won, that you got justice or truth or whatever you were looking for, but you didn't win anything. You just broke a family apart. And someday, when you're older, when you need someone to take care of you, you'll understand what I did, and you'll understand why I deserved that money. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't want it. I just want you to know that this is on you. The fracture, the pain, the permanent damage. You chose this. Remember that. The letter wasn't signed. I read it twice, then put it in a folder with all the other documents from the case. The petitions, the rulings, the forensic accountant's report, the appellate decision, evidence of what had happened, preserved for what? For history? For future generations? For my own reference in case I ever doubted? I didn't respond to the letter. There was nothing to say. My mother had written it to shift blame, to make herself the victim, to rewrite the narrative one more time. But the official narrative was already written, in court records that would exist forever, in findings of fact that no letter could change. She'd stolen from her dying mother. The court had found this to be true, and she'd been held accountable. That was enough. The months after the judgment payment were strange. I'd expected some sense of closure, of completion, but instead I felt suspended in a kind of aftermath that had no clear boundaries. The case was over, legally. The money had been recovered and distributed. The court records were final. But the emotional residue remained, settling into my daily life in ways I hadn't anticipated. I started having dreams about my grandmother's house. Not nightmares exactly, but unsettling dreams, where I'd walk through the empty rooms, searching for something I couldn't name. The house in my dreams was always as it had been before the estate sale, furnished, lived in, full of her things. But when I'd reach for something, a book, a photograph, a piece of jewelry, it would dissolve in my hands, or I'd discover it was just a photograph of the object, flat and two-dimensional. I mentioned this to Rachel during one of our regular calls. We still talked weekly, though the conversations had shifted. Without the case to discuss, we were learning who we were to each other beyond our shared mission. "I think that's grief," Rachel said. "Delayed grief, maybe. You were so focused on the case for so long that you didn't have space to actually mourn her. Now there's space, and it's coming out." "It's been 6 years. Grief doesn't care about timelines. My therapist says it surfaces when it surfaces." "You're seeing a therapist?" "Started a few months ago. Trevor suggested it. He said I seemed angry all the time, even about small things, and maybe I should talk to someone." She paused. He was right. I was angry. Still am sometimes. But I'm working on it. We talked about other things. Her upcoming CPA exam, Trevor's job promotion, a trip they were planning to Japan, normal things. Life continuing despite and around the wreckage of what had happened. Uncle David called less frequently, but when we did talk, he sounded lighter somehow. The therapy was helping. He'd set boundaries with some other people in his life, a demanding boss, a friend who'd been taking advantage of his generosity. Turns out the stuff with Linda was just the most extreme version of a pattern I've had my whole life, he said. Let people take from me because I was afraid of conflict. I'm trying to be different now. It's hard, but good. His daughters were thriving. Rachel was engaged to Trevor, planning a summer wedding. Emma, the middle daughter, had started graduate school. Sophie, the youngest, was teaching elementary school and had just bought her first house. David talked about them with uncomplicated pride, grateful that despite everything, his immediate family had stayed intact. "Margaret wants to invite you to Rachel's wedding," he said during one call. "If you're comfortable with that, you've become important to Rachel and to us, your family." "Will my mother be invited?" "No." Rachel was clear about that. She said she wants her wedding to be a happy day, and Linda's presence would make that impossible. I accepted the invitation. The idea of being at a family wedding without my mother there felt both sad and liberating, a visible marker of how things had permanently changed. In March, 7 years after my grandmother's death, I received a message through LinkedIn. The sender was someone named Patricia Whitmore, my mother's younger cousin, someone I'd met maybe twice at family gatherings decades ago. The message was brief. I heard about what happened with the estate. I wanted you to know that Linda did something similar to my mother, her aunt, about 15 years ago. My mother had a stroke and gave Linda power of attorney to help manage things temporarily. When my mother recovered, she discovered that Linda had transferred about $30,000 from her accounts. My mother was too ashamed to pursue it legally. She didn't want the family drama, but she never spoke to Linda again. I thought you should know you're not the only one. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I called Rachel. "She did this before," I said when Rachel answered. "At least once before, maybe more. It's a pattern." "That makes sense," Rachel said. She didn't sound surprised. People don't usually start stealing from family members at age 58. They build up to it, test boundaries, see what they can get away with. Patricia's mother never reported it. Most victims don't, especially in families. The shame, the desire to avoid conflict, the fear of being blamed for being taken advantage of. It's easier to just absorb the loss and move on. We reported it. We did. And maybe that stops her from doing it to someone else. Or maybe it doesn't. But at least there's a record now. If she tries this again, there's documented history of her behavior. I thanked Patricia for telling me and asked if she'd be willing to put her account in writing. She agreed. 2 weeks later, she sent me a notarized statement describing what Linda had done to her mother, with dates and account information. I added it to my file, not because I needed it for our case, that was closed, but because it felt important to preserve, evidence of a pattern, documentation for anyone else who might need it in the future. In June, I attended Rachel's wedding. It was held at a vineyard an hour outside the city on a warm afternoon with clear skies. The ceremony was simple, heartfelt. Rachel wore a dress that had belonged to my grandmother, not the wedding dress which had been lost or sold, but a cream-colored silk dress my grandmother had worn to special occasions. Rachel had found it in a box of items Uncle David had salvaged from the estate sale, had it altered to fit her. "Something of Grandma's," Rachel said when I complimented it before the ceremony. "I wanted her here somehow." During the reception, Uncle David gave a toast. He talked about Rachel's determination, her integrity, her unwillingness to accept injustice. He didn't mention the case explicitly, but everyone there knew what he was referring to. "Rachel taught me," he said, his voice thick, "that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing, and that standing up for what's right is worth the cost, even when that cost is high." Rachel cried. "So did I. So did most of the people at our table." Later, during dancing, Rachel pulled me aside. "I want to show you something." She held out her hand. On her right ring finger was a gold band with 3 small diamonds set in a row. "Do you recognize it?" I stared. "The 1919 ring, your great-grandmother's ring. How—" "It showed up in my mailbox 2 weeks ago. No note, no return address, just the ring in a padded envelope." "From who?" "I don't know. I have a theory, though. Remember Mrs. Chen, Grandma's neighbor? She's the only person outside immediate family who knew about that ring, who knew Grandma wanted me to have it. I think she somehow got it. Maybe Grandma gave it to her for safekeeping before she died. Or maybe Mrs. Chen took it when she visited during the estate sale period. Either way, she kept it safe and gave it to me when the time was right." "Did you ask her?" "I called to thank her, assuming it was from her. She said she was glad I got what Grandma wanted me to have, but she didn't confirm or deny sending it. Very diplomatic." Rachel held up her hand, admiring the ring in the light. "I don't care how it got here. It's here. That's what matters." I thought about Mrs. Chen's quiet intervention, her willingness to act outside official channels to honor my grandmother's wishes. Sometimes justice came through the courts, through forensic accountants and legal proceedings, and sometimes it came through an elderly neighbor who'd kept a ring safe for 7 years, waiting for the right moment. The summer after Rachel's wedding, I made a decision I'd been considering for months. I drove to the county courthouse and requested copies of all the public records from our case, the petitions, the rulings, the forensic accountant's report, the appellate decision, everything that was part of the public record. Then I drove to a document storage facility and rented a small climate-controlled unit. I filed everything systematically. Original documents in acid-free folders, digital copies on 3 separate hard drives, stored in different locations, a detailed index explaining what each document was, when it was created, what it proved. I included Patricia's statement about her mother. I included Mrs. Chen's handwritten testimony. I included photographs of my grandmother's house from before the estate sale, showing the items that later disappeared. Rachel came with me when I set up the storage unit. She brought her own documentation, spreadsheets, analysis, notes from our investigation. We spent an afternoon organizing everything, creating a comprehensive archive of what had happened. "Why are we doing this?" Rachel asked at one point. "The case is over. We won. Why preserve all of this?" "Because memories fade," I said. "Because in 10 years, or 20, someone might claim it happened differently. That Linda was unfairly accused, that the court was wrong, that we persecuted her for nothing. This way, anyone who wants to know the truth can access it. The evidence exists, independently of anyone's memory or interpretation. You're building a permanent record." "Yes." Rachel was quiet for a moment, organizing a stack of bank statements. "I like that. It's not about revenge at this point. It's about accuracy, making sure what actually happened is preserved." We finished the archive as the sun was setting. Before we left, I photographed the storage unit number and added it to a document I'd prepared, a guide to the archive, explaining what was stored there and why. I gave copies to Rachel, to Uncle David, and to my lawyer. If something happened to me, if the story needed to be told again, the evidence would be accessible. In the fall, 8 years after my grandmother's death, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. This is Susan Brenner with the Elder Justice Initiative. I'm an investigator with the District Attorney's Office. We've been reviewing cases of elder financial abuse, and your case against Linda Whitmore came to our attention. I was wondering if you'd be willing to speak with me. My pulse quickened. What kind of investigation? We're looking at whether criminal charges are warranted in cases where executors or people with power of attorney have systematically exploited vulnerable adults. Your civil case produced substantial evidence of financial exploitation. We'd like to understand whether criminal prosecution might be appropriate. The civil case is closed. It was settled. I understand. But criminal and civil proceedings are separate. The fact that you recovered funds through civil court doesn't preclude criminal charges for the underlying conduct. Theft is theft, regardless of whether restitution was made. I thought about my mother, about the letter she'd sent claiming she'd done nothing wrong, about Patricia's revelation that she'd done this before. What would you need from me? An interview, initially. We'd want to understand the timeline, the evidence you gathered, the forensic accountant's findings. If we decide to pursue charges, we might need you to testify before a grand jury. Would my mother go to jail? That would depend on many factors. The grand jury's decision, whether she accepts a plea agreement, what sentence the judge imposes if there's a conviction. But yes, jail time is a possible outcome in elder abuse cases involving this level of financial exploitation. I told Susan Brenner I'd think about it and call her back. Then I sat with the question, did I want my mother prosecuted criminally? Did I want her to potentially go to jail? I called Rachel first. What do you think? I think she deserves it, Rachel said immediately. She stole from her dying mother. She did it systematically, deliberately, over years. If she'd stolen that much money from a bank or an employer, she'd already be in prison. Why should stealing from family be treated differently? Because it's family. Because she's still my mother, even after everything. Is she? When's the last time you spoke to her? The letter, 3 years ago. Has she ever apologized? Shown any remorse? Acknowledged what she did? No? Then what are you protecting? The idea of a mother-daughter relationship that doesn't actually exist anymore? I talked to Uncle David next. He was more conflicted. Part of me thinks she should face criminal consequences. What she did was criminal, objectively. But another part of me just wants it to be over. I don't want more years of legal proceedings, more publicity, more drama. It wouldn't involve you as much, I said. Criminal cases are prosecuted by the state. You might have to testify, but the burden would be on the DA's office, not on us. Would it change anything? We already got the money back. She already lost her house. What would be different if she went to jail? It would be on her criminal record. It would follow her forever, and maybe it would deter her from doing this to someone else. David sighed. I'll support whatever you decide, but I don't have the energy to push for it myself. I spent a week thinking about it. I thought about my grandmother, about the systematic way my mother had exploited her failing health and trust. I thought about Patricia's mother, who'd suffered in silence. I thought about the potential future victims, people who might give my mother power of attorney or executorship, not knowing her history. I called Susan Brenner back. I'll cooperate with your investigation. The investigation took 9 months. Susan Brenner and her team interviewed me, Rachel, Uncle David, Mrs. Chen, the forensic accountant, my lawyer. They subpoenaed additional bank records, phone records, emails. They built their case methodically, the same way we'd build ours. In August, 9 years after my grandmother's death, a grand jury indicted Linda Marie Whitmore on 3 counts of theft from a vulnerable adult and 2 counts of abuse of a fiduciary relationship. The charges carried potential sentences ranging from probation to 15 years in prison. My mother hired a criminal defense attorney. She pleaded not guilty. A trial was scheduled for the following spring. I didn't attend most of the criminal proceedings. I'd testified at the grand jury, given my statement, turned over our documentation. The rest was the state's responsibility. But I did attend the sentencing hearing after my mother accepted a plea agreement rather than going to trial. The courtroom was nearly empty. Just me, Rachel, Uncle David, my mother's attorney, the prosecutor, and a few court staff. My mother sat at the defense table in a gray suit, her hair shorter than I remembered, her face thinner. She looked older, diminished. The judge reviewed the plea agreement. My mother had agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of theft from a vulnerable adult in exchange for the other charges being dropped. The agreed-upon sentence was 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and an additional $75,000 in restitution to cover the state's investigation costs. "Mrs. Whitmore," the judge said, "do you understand that by accepting this plea, you're admitting that you stole from your mother, a vulnerable adult who trusted you?" "Yes, Your Honor." My mother's voice was quiet but steady. "Do you have anything you'd like to say before I impose sentence?" My mother stood. She looked at the judge, not at us. "I love my mother. I took care of her during the hardest time of her life. What I did with the money, I believed I was entitled to it for the work I'd done. I understand now that the law sees it differently. I accept responsibility for my actions." It wasn't an apology. It was barely an acknowledgement, but it was the closest thing to an admission I'd ever heard from her. The judge imposed the agreed sentence. My mother would report to county jail in 30 days. She'd be eligible for work release after 6 months if she maintained good behavior. After the hearing, we stood in the hallway outside the courtroom. My mother walked past us with her attorney, her eyes forward, her face carefully blank. She didn't look at any of us. She didn't speak. Rachel squeezed my hand. "It's over now, really over." I nodded. 10 years after my grandmother's death, my mother had been held accountable not just civilly, but criminally. The record was complete. The justice system, slow and imperfect as it was, had done its work. Uncle David hugged me in the parking lot. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up, for caring enough to see this through all the way to the end. We did it together. You started it. You and Rachel. I just followed." We stood there for a moment, 3 people who'd been bound together by betrayal and determination, who'd spent a decade seeking accountability. The weight of it, the years, the effort, the cost, settled around us like dust after a long storm. Then we went home, back to our ordinary lives, our jobs and relationships and daily routines. The case was closed. The chapter was finished, but the record remained, permanent, true, accessible to anyone who needed to know what had really happened. My mother served 11 months of her 18-month sentence. She was released early for good behavior and enrolled in a work release program, spending her days at a nonprofit office doing data entry, her nights in a halfway house. I learned this not from her, but from a victim notification system that sent me updates whenever her status changed. I never visited her in jail. Neither did Uncle David. She had no other family who maintained contact. Richard had divorced her 6 months into her incarceration, citing irreconcilable differences and the public humiliation of the criminal case. He kept their primary residence. She was left with whatever she'd managed to save from the restitution payments and legal fees. Rachel asked me once if I felt guilty about not visiting. We were having coffee near her office. She'd made partner at her accounting firm, was building a reputation as an expert in forensic accounting and fraud detection. The case that had consumed years of our lives had, in some strange way, become the foundation of her career. "No," I said. "I don't feel guilty. I feel nothing." like she's a stranger who happens to share my DNA. That's healthy, I think. You don't owe her anything just because she gave birth to you. Do you ever think about what Grandma would have wanted? Whether she'd have wanted us to forgive Linda, to maintain some kind of relationship? Rachel considered this. I think Grandma would have wanted the truth. She was a practical person. She valued honesty, accuracy, things being done correctly. I think she'd be satisfied that the record is accurate now, that what happened is documented and acknowledged, not hidden or denied. I thought about this often in the years that followed, whether we'd honored my grandmother's memory through our pursuit of justice, or whether we'd simply satisfied our own need for vindication. The line between the two was blurrier than I'd expected. My mother was released from the halfway house in the spring, 11 years after my grandmother's death. She moved to a small apartment in a different state. Oregon, I heard through the victim notification system. She got a job doing bookkeeping for a small construction company. She was barred from serving as executor or having power of attorney for anyone due to her conviction. Her ability to exploit others was legally constrained, at least in official capacities. I wondered sometimes what her life was like, whether she thought about what she'd done, whether she experienced remorse or simply resentment, whether she blamed herself or still blamed us for exposing her. I'd never know. We'd never speak again. 3 years after my mother's release, Mrs. Chen died. She was 91, passed peacefully in her sleep. Her daughter called to tell me, knowing I'd want to know. The funeral was small. Family, a few neighbors, some people from her church. I attended and sat in the back, watching people eulogize a woman who'd been kind to my grandmother, who'd preserved a ring for 7 years, who'd testified about conversations she'd overheard. At the reception afterward, Mrs. Chen's daughter approached me. I found something when I was going through Mom's things. She left a note saying, "You should have it." She handed me a sealed envelope with my name on it in Mrs. Chen's shaky handwriting. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single photograph. My grandmother in her garden, maybe 15 years ago, kneeling beside her rose bushes, smiling at the camera. She looked happy, healthy, whole. On the back, in Mrs. Chen's writing, remember her this way. Before the illness, before the complications, this is who she was. I started crying there in Mrs. Chen's daughter's living room, surrounded by strangers eating casserole and sharing memories of a woman I'd barely known, but who'd given me a gift I didn't know I needed, a reminder that my grandmother was more than the victim of her daughter's theft, that her life had been full and rich and meaningful in ways that had nothing to do with estate proceedings or forensic accountants. I had the photograph framed. It sits on my desk now, in my home office. I see it every day. Rachel had her first child 14 years after my grandmother's death, a daughter she named Helen, after our grandmother. I became Aunt Sophie, a title that felt both strange and right. Uncle David became Grandpa David, a role he embraced with uncomplicated joy. At Helen's christening, Rachel asked me to be godmother. During the ceremony, holding this tiny person who carried our grandmother's name, I felt the weight of what we'd done shift into something else. We hadn't just pursued justice or correction or accountability, we'd also preserved something, created a record that Helen could access someday if she wanted to understand her family history, know who her great-grandmother was, learn what had happened and why. "Will you tell her?" I asked Rachel later at the reception. "About the case. About what Linda did?" "When she's old enough to understand, yes. Not to make her afraid of family or cynical about people, but to teach her that sometimes doing the right thing requires courage and patience. That injustice doesn't have to be accepted just because it's committed by family. That's a heavy lesson. It's a necessary one." Uncle David retired at 67, 2 years after Helen was born. He and Margaret downsized to a smaller house, spent their time traveling, visiting their daughters and grandchildren, tending a garden Margaret had always wanted. He seemed lighter than I'd ever seen him. The therapy had helped. The resolution of the case had helped. The simple passage of time had helped. "I don't think about Linda much anymore," he told me once when I visited for dinner. "For years, I thought about her every day, angry, hurt, confused. But that faded. She's just someone I used to know now, someone who turned out to be different than I thought." Do you miss having a sister? I miss having the sister I thought she was, but that person never really existed. I was just seeing what I wanted to see. On the 15th anniversary of my grandmother's death, I drove to the cemetery where she was buried. I hadn't visited often, 5 times, maybe 6, in 15 years. Grief had never drawn me to grave sites, but on this particular November morning, cold and overcast, I wanted to be there. Her headstone was simple: Helen Marie Patterson, 1939 to 2023, beloved mother and grandmother. We'd chosen the inscription carefully, Rachel and Uncle David and I, in the strange days after the funeral when everything felt raw and unformed. We'd wanted something true, something that honored her without glossing over complexity. I stood there for a while, hands in my pockets, watching dead leaves skitter across the grass. I thought about everything that had happened in 15 years: the investigation, the legal proceedings, the appeals, the criminal case, the settlements and payments and archived documentation, the fractured family, the lost relationships, the permanent changes. "We held her accountable," I said aloud, to the stone or the air, or maybe to my grandmother herself. "We made sure everyone knows what happened. We corrected the record." The wind picked up, cold enough to make me shiver. "I don't know if you'd be proud or disappointed. Rachel thinks you'd approve. David thinks you'd want us to have forgiven her. I don't know what I think." I stayed a few more minutes, then walked back to my car. As I drove away from the cemetery, I thought about inheritance. Not the monetary kind that had consumed so many years of our lives, but the other kind, the inheritance of character, of principles, of how to move through the world. My grandmother had been meticulous, organized, someone who believed in doing things correctly. She'd kept records, labeled belongings, made her wishes clear. In pursuing the case against my mother, we'd been following her example, documenting, preserving, insisting on accuracy. But my grandmother had also been forgiving, had loved her difficult daughter despite everything, and I'd never managed that. Couldn't manage it, even now, 15 years later. That inheritance I'd failed to claim. Maybe that was okay. Maybe we got to choose which parts of our inheritance we kept, which parts we let go. Maybe honoring someone's memory didn't mean becoming them, but rather carrying forward the pieces that resonated, that made sense in our own lives. I drove home through the gray November afternoon, past houses decorated for the holidays, past families doing ordinary things. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "Thinking about you today. Call me if you need to talk." I called. We talked for an hour, not about the case or my mother or anything heavy. Just life. Helen's recent accomplishments. She was walking now, saying a few words. Trevor's new job. Rachel's latest fraud case, which reminded her of our investigation, but in reverse. A son stealing from his wealthy father. "Does it ever feel strange?" I asked. "That the worst experience of our lives became the thing you're known for professionally?" "Sometimes. But mostly it feels like making meaning from trauma. Taking something painful and turning it into something useful. I help people now because I learned how to investigate fraud through investigating Linda. That's not nothing." After we hung up, I sat in my living room and thought about meaning-making, about how we transform experiences, reshape them into narratives that serve purposes beyond the original events. The case wasn't just about recovering stolen money or holding my mother accountable. It had become a story about perseverance, about refusing to accept injustice, about the slow machinery of institutional justice. That story was documented in the storage unit Rachel and I maintained, in court records anyone could access, in the conviction on my mother's criminal record. It existed independently of us now, available to whoever needed it. I thought about Helen growing up, eventually learning about her great-grandmother and what had happened. She'd have access to the complete story, not just family mythology or selective memory, but documented evidence. She'd be able to form her own understanding, reach her own conclusions. That felt important, essential even. We'd created an inheritance of truth. I pulled out my laptop and opened a document I'd been working on intermittently for months, a written account of everything that had happened, from those first Sunday visits to my grandmother's house through the criminal sentencing and beyond. Not a legal document, but a personal narrative. Something Helen could read someday, or anyone else who wanted to understand not just what happened, but what it felt like to live through it. I wrote for hours that night, and many nights after. The process was different from documenting evidence or filing legal briefs. This was memory, reflection, the attempt to capture not just facts but meaning. Why we'd done what we'd done, what it had cost, what we'd gained and lost. 6 months later, I finished the manuscript. It was 127 pages long, a memoir of sorts, though I had no plans to publish it. I printed 3 copies. One I kept for myself, one I gave to Rachel, one I gave to Uncle David. For Helen, I told Rachel when I gave her the copy, for whenever she's ready, so she'll know not just what happened, but why we cared enough to fight for 15 years. Rachel paged through it, reading random sections. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. This is the real inheritance, isn't it? Not the money we recovered. This, the story, the truth. I think so. Thank you for writing it, for preserving all of it. She closed the manuscript carefully, held it against her chest. Grandma would have appreciated this, the thoroughness of it, the accuracy. That word again, accuracy. It had been our North Star through everything, the desire to have an accurate record of what happened, to correct the false accounting, to document the truth so completely that it couldn't be denied or revised. We'd succeeded. The inheritance my grandmother had intended, the fair distribution of her estate, the specific bequests to people she loved, had been restored as much as possible. The inheritance my mother had tried to claim through theft had been reclaimed through patient institutional justice. And now there was this third inheritance, the story itself, the documented account of what happens when betrayal is met with determination, when theft is met with accountability, when family loyalty is superseded by commitment to truth. That inheritance would outlast all of us. Long after Rachel and I were gone, after Uncle David and even little Helen, the records would remain. Court documents, forensic reports, this memoir, evidence that my grandmother had lived, had been betrayed, and had been honored by those who came after her, not through dramatic confrontations or immediate revenge, but through the slow, quiet, methodical work of documentation and institutional justice, through the architecture of accountability, built carefully over 15 years. I thought about my mother sometimes, living her diminished life in Oregon, working her small job, carrying the weight of her conviction and the knowledge that she'd lost everything, her home, her husband, her family, her reputation, because she couldn't stop taking what wasn't hers. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't feel much of anything toward her except a distant sadness for what might have been different if she'd made different choices, if she'd been content with her share, if she'd honored our grandmother instead of exploiting her. But she hadn't, and we documented that with meticulous care. That was the inheritance that mattered, not the money, though we'd recovered that too, not revenge, though there was satisfaction in accountability, but the truth, preserved in multiple formats, accessible to future generations, immune to revision or denial. My grandmother's true inheritance wasn't the house or the jewelry or the investment accounts. It was the example she'd set of precision, of record-keeping, of doing things properly. And in fighting to restore her intended legacy, we'd honored that example. We'd become the people she'd taught us to be, meticulous, patient, committed to accuracy above all else. That was enough. That would have to be enough. On a quiet Tuesday evening, 16 years after my grandmother's death, I received an email notification that the storage unit rental was coming up for renewal. I could renew for another year, or close the unit, or transfer ownership to someone else. I called Rachel. "Do you still want to maintain the archive?" "Yes," she said immediately. "Helen should have access to it when she's older, and who knows, maybe someone else will need it someday. Another family member Linda tries to exploit, or a researcher studying elder abuse, or just someone who wants to understand what happened." "Okay, I'll renew it." "We should add your memoir to the archive, the physical copy along with a digital version. Make it part of the official record." "That feels right." We met at the storage unit the following Saturday. It had been years since I'd visited. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. The careful organization, the indexed files, the chronological arrangement. We added my memoir to the collection, filed it properly, updated the index. Before we left, Rachel took a photograph of the organized shelves, the rows of evidence and documentation. "For Helen's baby book," she said, "so she'll know that her family believes in truth, in accuracy, in not letting injustice stand unchallenged." We locked the unit and walked to our cars in the fading afternoon light. Rachel hugged me, something that had become natural over 16 years of shared purpose. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "All the time and energy and emotional cost?" I thought about the question. 16 years, thousands of hours, substantial legal fees, even with contingency arrangements, a fractured family that would never heal, a mother I'd never speak to again. "No," I said, "I don't regret it." "Neither do I." We drove away in opposite directions, back to our separate lives, carrying the weight and satisfaction of what we'd accomplished together. The quiet revenge that wasn't revenge at all, but something more patient and lasting. Justice, documented, truth, preserved. An inheritance reclaimed and reimagined, passed down not through blood or legal documents, but through the careful work of holding power accountable, of refusing to let betrayal stand unchallenged, of insisting that the truth matters enough to fight for, year after year after year. That was my grandmother's true legacy, and we'd honored it the only way that mattered, by following her example, meticulously, completely, accurately, until the very end.